Welcome to this memorial conference in honor of David Shneer, who was a friend and colleague and mentor to many people in this physical room, many people in this Zoom room, and many people throughout the myriad of academic fields and parts of the Jewish community that he touched over the course of his life. My name is Samira Mehta, and I am the Director of Jewish Studies here at the University of Colorado Boulder, a position in which I follow in David's footsteps. This evening's program has been supported by a number of academic units and programs, both here at CU and beyond, and I want to note that that has happened because of the love and respect that people had for David as a scholarly mind, a mentor, a builder of institutions, and most importantly, as a human being. I will say more about David and my own relationship with him in a moment, but first I want to thank all those who made this evening possible. The Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto, the College of Idaho, the Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Denver, and here at CU, the Dean of Arts and Humanities, the Departments of History, Religious Studies, and Women's and Gender Studies, and of course, the David Shneer Fund for Public Scholarship, Community Programming, and the Arts. I only spent a semester working with David here at CU. His cancer returned very early in my second semester on the faculty, and so I will leave it to others to talk about his role in the University of Colorado Boulder ecosystem. But I would like to talk to you a little bit about how I got to know David in the world of Jewish studies long before I came to CU. First of all, I can't remember a time in my career when I did not know about David's work. In fact, the things that he wrote that come closest to my field, Queer Jews and New Jews, were published in the year that I started my master's degree and the year that I started my PhD, respectively. So David's influence on American Jewish history, not his primary area of study, shaped my entire intellectual trajectory. And what was important about those works is that they enshrined kinds of Jewish lives that are often at the margins and not covered by the study of American Judaism. In archival form, he brought attention to those communities. And that passion for Jewish innovation and Jewish margins informed his collecting as well as an archivist, as a sort of builder of archives through the Innovations in Jewish Life collections, which is a program, a partnership between the Program in Jewish Studies and the university libraries, which he imagined from the start as a place to document the innovations and developments in American Jewish life that were not otherwise being caught in the archival net, mostly because those innovations were made by people who were not necessarily intelligible to the mainstream or part of the institutions that are most likely to house and donate their papers to archives. I'm honored to carry forward his legacy as the academic director of the Innovations in Jewish Life collections. And I encourage all of you to come and visit them in the university library and see that piece of David's commitment to creating and maintaining and preserving history. Despite the importance of his work on my intellectual development, I only really got to know David when he and I both found ourselves on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the Association for Jewish Studies. Led by the indomitable Carla Goldman, our task was too broad to even be possible. We were to cover all aspects of inclusion that were not being covered by the Sexual Harassment Task Force and the Contingent Labor Task Force. So that's to say almost everything. We had no budget, little authority, and the AJS leadership wanted us to focus on the people who were in the organization rather than to ask why other people were not there. Another way of putting this was that they wanted us, again with neither budget nor authority, to, for instance, work on problems of racism within the institution, rather than to ask why there were so few scholars of color at the conference. And it was on this committee that I got to see David work. I got to see how he looked to build equity and alliances. I saw his ability to analyze problems and his willingness to marshal his privilege for others. It was also there that I got to learn that David was willing to throw an elbow for people who had less privilege than he did, that he was not shy about it, and he was brilliant at amplifying other people's voices. I think tied to that skill was an aspect of David that perhaps strikes me as the most remarkable. David was full of self-confidence. He knew that he was a brilliant scholar. But while many people who know themselves to be brilliant scholars need others to build them up, David used his brilliance to build other people up. It was on that committee that I learned David's gift of mentorship, his ability to use his own confidence and brilliance to help you find your confidence and brilliance that you did not know that you had, but that he could see in you. And I saw him offer that gift to every single junior member of that committee. You would hear, as we walked into committee meetings, people thanking him for conversations that had happened before the meeting, or you would hear that he was sticking around afterwards to talk to somebody. And those were always moments when he was lifting up other people and their scholarship and infusing them with sort of his enthusiasm and his confidence in their projects. And then when he died, I heard many people speak of that gift. And so tonight we are going to do two things. First, we are going to hear from a number of speakers about the impact that David had on CU and on Denver, the University of Denver, on DU, as a builder of institutions and as a mentor. And then we will have a scholarly panel in which those in his many fields speak to the impact that he had on their work. Our Dean, John Michael Rivera, could not be with us this evening, the Dean of Arts and Humanities here at CU, but he has sent some words, and I would invite Phoebe Young, Chair of the History Department, forward to both share JM's reflections and some of her own.
Thanks, Samira, and I'm honored and privileged to be here tonight, and I'll just first say a couple of things before I read JM's words. First, to my colleagues in the history department, don't worry, I'm not trying to be dean, just reading the words that he wrote. Good. No ambitions for that. The second is just to say that I'm a U.S. historian, and David and I's work didn't intersect that much, but when I arrived at CU in 2009, he was just one of the first most welcoming colleagues. And we struck up a friendship that lasted all the time that we were colleagues together in the Department of History. And we all knew that he had so many other responsibilities and passions that he worked on in the university, but yet he never failed to show up for history. And we would often sit together in department meetings and pass notes to each other and giggle. And there are many more stories that I could relate, but my memory is just of him as an incredibly supportive colleague, a dear friend who often made me laugh and made me feel very much at home. So here I'll read what JM has sent. I want to first apologize for not being here tonight. I hurt my knee walking or tripping over my daughter's pint-sized pooch in Texas at 2 a.m. this morning. And after running through the airport, I find myself now lame in Denver. Though not present, I wanted to relate to you a story that meant a lot to me, my career, and I think reveals a lot about David and the program that he championed. I first met David when I had become a reluctant administrator in 2012. Back then, the chairs would meet in person in the basement of Old Main. They would gather and sit around a long table with 14 chairs, and then there was room for another 8 or 10 on the back wall, under the windows. To a new administrator and a recently tenured faculty member, this room was very intimidating. Most of those in the room were full professors and very accomplished. I found myself reluctantly entering the room and in fact made many excuses not to go to the first few meetings due to the awkward intimidation that this type of meeting cultivated. Having been finally summoned by the dean to attend, I found myself in the room, frozen at the door, trying to see where I could sit. I felt the anxious memories of the middle school cafeteria take hold and started walking towards the edges. I was eyeing the farthest corner of the room, far away from the dean. 2 steps in, and David, with his large and infectious smile, gets up and walks over to greet me. "Welcome. Come take the chair by me. Everyone, this is John Michael Rivera. He is new to the table, and we're lucky he's joined us." Now, know that I had never formally met David, nor did I know he knew who I was. I, of course, knew who he was. Everyone did. He's one of arts and humanities' most accomplished scholars and public intellectuals, and also worked in the arts. He was, to me, a role model. He went into administration before he was a full professor, like me, and like me, he worked at museums and in the arts and wrote essays in more mainstream venues. And like me, he was the only director at the table, as opposed to chairs. I directed the program in writing and rhetoric, and he Jewish studies. But David, I must confess, was simply better at all of the things that we held in common, and that I agree with the dean. But then, and with his kind gesture, "Come take a chair by me," I also found that he was a lot nicer than me. It was with this first act, and in dozens of conversations and stances he would take at that table over time, that I learned to be an ethical and caring administrator. And the offer of a seat to someone is not simply an act of manners. It revealed to me the core character of David and the worlds he built around him. As director of Jewish studies, as scholar, as writer, as friend, he spent his time being inclusive and ensuring that everyone had a seat at the table. I unfortunately did not become super close with David. The stresses and lack of time when in administration have a way of making new friendships hard to develop. But in the last weeks, I find myself thinking more of David and those days at the table. And after talking to Samira about saying a few words, I realized I did in fact know David. And I'm honored and a lot better of a person for him simply offering me that seat at the table. Thank you, David. I never truly thanked you for that enormously generous act.
I would now like to invite forward Eli Sachs, Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Jewish Studies here at the University of Colorado Boulder, and someone else who has also followed in David's footsteps as a director of the program in Jewish Studies here.
Thank you, Samira. As many of you may know, this Saturday night will mark the beginning of the Jewish holiday of Passover. And traditionally, many individuals and communities that celebrate this holiday will do so by holding a festive meal on the first night, maybe the first 2 nights. And at this festive meal, it's customary to kind of tell the story behind this holiday of Passover. It's a story about liberation from slavery. And there's a text that's used to tell the story. It's a text known as the Haggadah. And in that text, there's a passage that appears, which has really been going through my mind again and again and again, ever since Samira asked me to share a few words about David's role in establishing Jewish studies here at CU Boulder. And this is a passage that tells the story of 5 rabbis. They gather together one evening for a festive meal. They tell the story of Passover, and they become so engrossed that they end up spending the whole night in conversation, and they lose track of time until their students rush in and tell them that it is morning. And the reason that this story has been going through my head, I think, is that this story is, in its own way, about many of the things that mattered so much to David when he created the program here in Jewish Studies at Boulder. So first of all, this is a story about the creation of an intellectual community, about people coming together to learn with one another and think with one another and rejoice with one another. And that's so much of what David envisioned when he helped establish the program here, the creation of a genuine intellectual community. So first, he envisioned the creation of a Jewish studies community, a space where faculty and staff and students interested in Jewish history and Jewish culture and Jewish life and Jewish religion and Jewish language and Jewish art and Jewish music could come together with one another. I was looking back at my emails, and the 2nd through 10th emails I received from David after activating my CU account were all emails with details about a works in progress colloquium series that he was organizing on campus and that he wanted me to be a part of. So before I even knew where my office was on campus or how to log on to the campus internet, David was already trying to include me in the community on campus. He envisioned the creation not just of a Jewish studies community, but of a CU community, a community where faculty and staff and students from diverse disciplines and diverse backgrounds could also come together. And I think you see evidence of that in the number of units that are co-sponsoring this gathering and in the remarks from John Michael. And finally, he envisioned the creation not just of a Jewish studies community and not just of a CU community, but a Colorado community, a community where members of this institution and members of the broader public could come together and think with one another, a space where conversations would be open to everyone, where public engagement mattered, and where we could really try to figure out what it means to be a public university. So this is, I think, one of the reasons that this passage has been going through my mind. It's a passage about community, and David was a consummate and inveterate community builder. So that's one reason. A second reason I think that this passage has been going through my mind is that it's a passage about teachers and students. And as brilliant of a scholar as David was, and we're going to hear more about that shortly, he was an even better teacher. And he's someone who pushed all of us to be the best teachers that we could be. Later tonight, not during the session, but later tonight, go on YouTube and type in David Shneer Program in Jewish Studies, and you will find a video that David recorded in 2013 about the program in Jewish Studies here, and it is a joy to watch. You will see his face light up as he talks about what a Jewish Studies curriculum can look like, what a Jewish Studies internship class can look like, what a Jewish Studies infused liberal arts education can look like. And that's not all. You'll also see his students have their faces light up as he stands in front of them and walks among them and waves his arms around in front of them and models a love of learning for them. Not every academic loves teaching, but David did, and he created a community here that would try to center that love and empower, but also challenge all of us to be the best teachers we could be. I learned more from conversations with David about pedagogy and inclusive classrooms and student engagement than I've learned from any workshop, and I think I'm probably not alone in that. The final reason I think that this passage from the Passover text has been going through my head is that it's also a passage about passion. When I think about those rabbis losing track of time, I imagine them doing so because they cared so much about what they were doing, because they saw their discussion of the story and this history not just as a kind of theoretical exercise, but as a way to shape the world, as a way to bring the past into the present, as a way to take the lessons of history and enact them in the world around them. And that's so much of what motivated David. He could sit in an archive by himself with the best of us, but he was also deeply committed to creating a program and a community and an ethos that would focus on just sort of relentlessly shaping lives locally, nationally, and internationally, whether it was placing a student in a job or empowering faculty to teach and research controversial issues, or encouraging many of us to take on kind of different roles in higher education. David was someone who always reminded us that higher education is a values-driven enterprise. And I think for many of us, he kind of taught us what it meant to bring that passion for principles to everything that we do. I want to conclude by doing something that I don't think I've ever done at a CU event. I don't think you should be nervous. And that's actually quote a passage from the Bible. And it's a passage from the 5th book of the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Deuteronomy. And it's a passage where a key figure in the Bible, and actually a key figure in the Passover story, a kind of prophetic leader named Moses, is about to die. And he's going to give one final speech to the assembled people. And the speech by Moses begins as follows. He says, "May my discourse come down as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, like showers on young growth, like droplets on the grass." This is what David's work was. His speech, his discourse, his teaching, his relationship building, his community building. It was like rain. It was like dew. It was a form of nourishment that sustained so many of us and enabled so many initiatives and programs and communities to grow and flourish. I miss David every time I'm on campus, but I'm so very grateful and honored to be part of the community that he created. Thank you.
I would now like to invite forward Sam Boyd, who is an associate professor of religious studies and Jewish studies here at CU. He is also serving once again as the director of undergraduate studies for the program in Jewish studies. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you so much, Samira. It is an absolute honor to be here. And I think I can actually say quite literally, I would not be here if it weren't for David. I remember the first time I encountered David. I was in that very uncertain time between defending my dissertation and actually graduating, thinking, what did I just do? I went to graduate school. What am I going to do with my life? We decided that maybe we'd move to Colorado. And so I knocked on doors and David immediately answered. We had a Skype conversation back when that existed, before everything became Zoom. He was in Germany, I was in Chicago. I remember going into the conversation feeling despondent. Is anybody going to see me? Is anybody going to see the value that I could bring to an academic community? I've, after all, spent 10 years parsing verbs and declining nouns in ancient manuscripts. Why wouldn't that be self-evidently awesome to everybody else? David immediately saw me in the room, and it was a feeling that gave me so much joy. I remember coming out of that room and talking to my wife, wow, there could actually be possibility here. From that first encounter with David, the theme of mentorship, of one of creating possibility, but not for himself, possibility for others. One of my favorite authors said once, freedom is never what you take for yourself, it's always what you create for somebody else. David was so incredibly virtuosic at that skill. He also worked on me with my scholarship, constantly asking me, how does these ancient manuscripts, verb parsings, noun declining, as awesome as they are and as great as that academic expertise is, so what? I think the last email I ever got from him was in response to an article I wrote in a website called theconversation.com. And it was finally, I feel like, connecting some of the values that he instilled with me to let's make the world a better place. I don't think I've ever met anybody in academia who had such a clear-eyed vision of what the university is, what it could be, and the responsibility we all should take to make the world a better place. And I think about that constantly in my own work. But his teaching was like this too. There's another passage from the Bible, this time from what I like to call Greek Midrash, or the New Testament. James chapter 3 says, don't become a teacher. Why? Because you're going to get judged. You get judged a lot. So don't do it. David took on that responsibility with glee. He absolutely cared for his students. And I still remember one time when I was considering whether I'd stay at CU or I'd go somewhere else. He said, sure, you can go to that other institution, teach 5 PhD students every year, but what happens if you teach here and teach undergraduates, teach hundreds of them, and create civic-minded people who can ask critical questions in the world? Wouldn't that be a wonderful life? I think about that all the time. Every August, I am excited to stand in front of undergraduates again because of David's influence. And I still remember him modeling this for me. One time, however many years ago, we were teaching in Helms. I was teaching right after he was. He was in the class before me with large lecture class. The type of lecture classes that would leave me exhausted. I'm an introvert. Once I'm done teaching, I want to go and take a nap in my office. I don't want to talk to graduates or undergraduate students or graduate students for that matter. David was in the hallway. The students were mesmerized with him, and it was like he had more energy coming out of the class than he had going in. He wanted the best out of his students, what could make them the best versions of themselves, not just what would make them little Davids, but how do we actually work together so that you can be the best you in the world? Wouldn't that be wonderful? I think about him every time I start a new project. I dedicated a book in his memory on the Tower of Babel because I wanted it to make some sort of real-world impact, hoping that that's the type of scholarship David would like to see here at CU. I really owe him everything, and I literally would not be here without him. Thank you so much.
As important as David was to us here at CU, he was also very important and left a very important legacy at DU. And so I would like to welcome Adam Ravner, the director, are you the director? For the Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Denver. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you all for coming tonight to honor David's memory. I want to tell you about the first time I met David, which was at a conference in Toronto for the AJS. And I was asking him, I don't even remember how we got started on this, but he started to explain to me that he was at the University of Denver and that he had a husband, Greg, and that he also had a daughter, Sasha, and Sasha's mother, Karen, all of whom were on his insurance. And he said to me, I was like, wait, what? And he said, yeah, I'm pushing the boundaries at DU about what family can be. And I think that that's a kind of a succinct story about David. He built up DU's Center for Judaic Studies by pushing boundaries. It existed before him, but he made it a professionalized center. He tested our center's limits by flexing its muscles, and thereby he made it stronger. And he also built family. I was sitting in a room of scholars today, some of whom I've never met. Each of them had been influenced by David's scholarship and by him and his personality. There's probably no more contentious crew on the planet than Judaic studies scholars, academics, and yet we all agreed about the centrality of David's work and influence on our lives. And it's true, David was an institution builder. He was a program builder, and he was a scholar of unusual reach. I think today when we enumerated what he had made his impact on, it was Holocaust studies, Eastern Central European Jewish studies, photography, queer studies. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few. The institutions that he helped serve in and build were better because of his scholarship and because of his teaching. But not all those institutions were brick and mortar institutions. He also built networks of scholars, of artists, of activists, and of friends. To me and to Jessica, my wife, David was a friend, and I miss his counsel continually. I would be better, both professionally and certainly personally, were he here to speak to me about different things. I want to tell you that I was not necessarily influenced by his scholarship. I was never his student, but he taught me a lot. He taught me about history, he taught me about scholarship, and he taught me about the business of higher education. He had the ability not only to make institutions better, but also to make people better. That's true. It's hard to imagine if you didn't know him. He pushed people's boundaries by asking questions, by listening, and by being genuinely open to challenge and to help his friends and his colleagues challenge themselves. And I also wasn't even his colleague. By the time I got to DU, he hired me. He had already moved on to CU. Nonetheless, we worked together. As my research and my writing drifted more towards history than to literature, which is what my proper training is, he was incredibly generous. He was enthusiastic about everything, and also about pretty much everything that the people he cared about did. I loved to talk through ideas with him over coffee or whiskey or walking around Cheeseman Park. The fact that people have come here from all across the US, from Canada, from Europe, is a testament to David's ability to build connections between people and institutions, and he did all that seemingly effortlessly. It was an annoying fact about David that he did everything seemingly effortlessly. I spent all day today with his husband Greg and with his friends and colleagues to talk about David's work and his influence. And I'm not given much to melancholy. Like David, I'm more of an enthusiast myself. But today, seeing all these connections between his colleagues and his friends, between DU, just a few miles down the road, and CU, and between all the disciplines and the places, the geographic places that he touched on, his presence in our lives was so great. And his loss today is very deep. Thank you.
So to minimize the up and down, I'm going to stay sitting for what's about to happen, and I'm going to suggest that all of the panelists also do so. I'm going to introduce the panel. Basically, what we have gathered are a group of scholars, half from CU, half from elsewhere, who have been influenced in some way by David's work. I'm going to introduce everyone, and then I'm going to ask them in turn, and unfortunately, I have an alphabetical list of who they are, which is not at all how they're sitting, which is my fault. I didn't tell them to alphabetize themselves. So I'm going to introduce everyone. I'm going to ask you to wave as I read your introduction. And then I'm going to pose one question. We're going to go down the row, starting with Thomas, ending with Nick, answering the question, and then I'll ask a couple of follow-up questions, and then we will turn to questions from the room and questions from the Zoom room. So, David Ciarlo is an associate professor of modern Germany at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I should say there are many, many things that I could say about all of these people, but I'm going to just give you the bare minimum of what you need to know. Erin Hutchinson is an assistant professor of the Soviet Union and modern Europe at the University of Colorado Boulder. Robby Peckerar, is that how your last name is pronounced?
Peckerar, yeah.
Is the founder of Yiddishkayt, an organization that promotes the culture, language, art, and worldviews of Eastern European Jews. Thomas Pegelow Kaplan is the Lewis P. Singer Endowed Chair in Jewish History at the University of Colorado Boulder. Anna Sternschieß is the director of the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto, where she holds the J. Richard and Dorothy Schiff Chair of Jewish Studies. Nick Underwood is an assistant professor of the assistant professor of history and director of Jewish Studies at the College of Idaho. And I would just like to also additionally thank Nick and Anna for their work in coordinating the events. They have worked very closely with me in putting this event together for all of you. So I am going to just ask each of you to reflect what was the impact of David Shneer's work and scholarship on your work. And so if we can just move, start with Thomas,
sure,
and
of course. Yeah,
take it away.
No, I mean, maybe I want to kind of preface real quick that unfortunately I never had the honor of meeting David in person. Our interactions have, however, been in cyberspace, and it leads me directly to kind of the main point in terms of influence. My own work started out with a focus on language. I'm really a Holocaust scholar by training, and as you can tell from my accent, I'm also German. And doing that type of work, I realized more that the visual side of it, David was severely lacking, and looking at David's work in this regard, and also, coming together with colleagues, especially in Israel, of working on a volume that is now kind of finally coming out on photography and Jewish history and memory. That's, of course, my point of contact with him. I contacted him, invited him, and despite the fact that he was already very, very sick, and I was really not aware, he nonetheless mustered the energy, and I see now how this is very characteristic of him in many ways, to respond and to engage, at least to the extent he was able to before, then had to gracefully kind of bow out. But now that the volume is finished and with the publisher, it struck me, I just did the index, that David is pretty much in every single chapter, beginning with the interview that we did in the beginning of it is Marianne Hirsch, not a minor scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but she is rightfully, of course, also playing up. And here's an important work. I mean, especially if you're like, many of you, of course, are familiar, but just to highlight one, the 2020 study on grief, right? This image from Kertsch from January of 1942, doctored up, often misunderstood whatsoever, is really a supreme case of scholarship, kind of issuing in almost like an entire subgenre. Now, of course, we have the books of like Wendy Lauer, like The Ravine, and Valerie Hebert, kind of on the killings in Latvia, especially Skede and others and stuff like that. It was really kind of David kind of shaping this, and also in many ways like what that kind of forthcoming volume is all about, close analysis of a specific photograph and the distinct overall aspects. I could go on and on, but I will not, because I'm one of many panelists, so I keep it for now as this. In short, I feel like I'm very indebted to someone, beginning with the share that Samira, of course, mentioned, indebted to somebody who's, the debt I will never be able to repay, no matter now how long I will be at CU, but I will certainly aspire to and do my very best. And I think even if I come close like a little bit, I've done, something that I think is very much kind of in line with what David envisions for the institution. So thank you.
David was one of my dearest friends, and also I met him at Cal when we were both graduate students. He was sort of the elder graduate student, as he was 2 years older than me. One of the things that I was always impressed with David, and that stuck with me, was that we worked in a field, we met in a Yiddish reading group, and our field of Yiddish cultural studies is one that is often overwhelmed by ideas of tragedy. And one of the things that I think that David was always so incredible at expressing was joy. And I think that one of the things that even just came up in the past number of remarks about him is just the kindness and joy and boundary pushing that David was always so incredible at. And and one of the things that I think about when I think about him the most is just the way that he was never overwhelmed by the tragedy of what our field has in it, and brought so much joy to it. And that was the thing that united us in our passion for our field. I remember that in 2005, we had a conference at Berkeley that David came from Denver to be a part of. And he gave a talk called How We're Haunted by the Figures That We Study. And unlike normal ideas of haunting or of ghosts or spectral figures, it was totally joyful. Like, it was about how we're inspired by these figures. Even in the face of the utmost horrors and atrocities of the 20th century, David was able to convey something that was filled with beauty and joy. And when I moved first to the Yiddish Book Center, he was the first person I called to be a part of a program that I was starting there to inspire students to see things in a similar way, to see things through joy and to meet the challenges of the cruelty of the world with kindness. And that's why I wanted him to be always at my side at all these endeavors. He was at my side for that program, and we joined together on a program to bring people on a traveling program, the first of many traveling programs that we led together in Eastern and Central Europe, that we called the Literatur, together in Ukraine, Poland, and in Austria. And I have so many memories of that experience from 2006. And one of the main memories I have is that when we landed in Kiev, David told me back then that he had a brain tumor, and I was one of the first people I think that he was telling that to, and part of that was just for health reasons while we were traveling together. But now in retrospect, I recognize the way that potentially there was a way that David approached the field of what we studied and teaching and sharing the story of human existence as encompassing all aspects of the human experience, from tragedy and joy, all together at once, that it has to be all together. You can't just focus on the tragedy, that the joy has to be there too. And even my memories of traveling with him, we were in Babin Yar, and David wore a cowboy hat and boots and stepped off the bus at the complex there. And it was just this juxtaposition of what we were about to face. And it wasn't in any way, it wasn't disrespectful, but it was just he brought himself to the place and allowed us to have humor there at a place of such tragedy. And that is one of the things that I think always influenced me the most. I remember on that trip also, there was a photograph that was taken of the two of us in a city, Chernovtsi, used to be called Chernovitz, where there was a famous event in Yiddish culture, and we went to the place where that conference took place, the first Yiddish language conference. And I'm a very frenetic person by nature, and we staged a reading of Yiddish poetry at the Jewish National House in Chernovitz, and the photograph of the two of us, I am a blur because I'm moving my hands like a stereotype of somebody, and David is standing there in the photograph in absolute calm, serenity, but exuding his typical confidence as he's reading the poems. Well, I am just a complete frenetic blur, and to me, that's what I remember of David, the way that he brought that contained, confident joy to the subject that we worked on. And then aside from all the kindness and joy that I think influenced me the most in thinking about David is, again, and Adam mentioned this about the boundary crossing, I think, literally we crossed many borders together, me and David, and I have such a distinct memory of us at the Belarusian-Latvian border where we were held up for maybe 6 hours at a border crossing, and David led a song in Yiddish that was called Lomir Ale Makabel Punim Zayin, which means let us all welcome. And it took us to process each individual who had to cross the border from Belarus into Latvia. Each one of us took an exorbitantly long time to cross. And David led us all in this ruckus singing of this song, welcoming everybody across the border as they came. So the border guards came and told us, you cannot sing at the border. And David said something respectful and kind, I'm certain, to the Belarusian or Latvian guard, and then just started up again, and we continued singing this Lomil Makabel Punim Zayin as every individual gradually crossed the border. And I think of that moment of just traversing these borders, crossing all sorts of borders together, and the continuous boundary pushing that David's work represents, that he always was able to do with such love and such joy and so much inspiration to everybody, I think, who came into contact with him. And yeah, I think it's already been, there is not a single project that I worked on from the time I was in graduate school until David's death that I did not discuss with him. There's not a piece of writing that I didn't send him. And it's something that I miss it tremendously, and I think that there's countless others who sought his counsel and wisdom and just his friendship and pushing our work forward, crossing boundaries and transcending together. And I miss him very much every day.
Okay. My name is Anna Sternches. David and I have belong to the same field of Soviet Jewish history studies. I'm repeating some of the stories to workshop participants, I'm sorry. It's not because I forgot what I said, it's just like I have to tell this story, although forgetting also happens sometimes now. We met in Moscow in 1999 when we worked on the same topic for our dissertations on Soviet Yiddish culture of 20s and 30s. And we saw each other's name. In Soviet archives, you had to sign every document you check out, you write your name. So his name is Shneer, my name is Sternschus. It was like so close, and yet we had that competition, who will get to the document first. So finally we met in the archive, and I found out about him. He was an American grad student. At that time I was a grad student at Oxford, and I was working in Moscow, but I am from Moscow. So I said to him, how are you handling being in Moscow? It's so hard for foreigners to be here, you know, like people are only friendly to those who they know and all this. And he says, oh my God, I'm having the blast. In fact, he says, I joined gay male choir. So there's a gay male choir in Moscow. And for the context, you know, my gay friends who are Russian just then started gradually coming out. Like most of us did not know who was. And here was David Shneer, this very happy, cheerful American grad student, singing in a choir with all these men and enjoying very new Moscow. And we stayed close colleagues and friends. You know, eventually writing each other's letters of recommendation, publishing books, more or less the same topic, at least the first one. Always reading each other's work and commenting on it. And in fact, now when I have my own grad students who are so worried about things like embargoing the dissertations, I learned that word embargo, I didn't even know what it meant, you know, or keeping things secret or not sharing this stuff, I always tell them the story of David Shneer and myself sitting and working on the same dissertation topic, applying for the same jobs, dealing with the same circles, and yet not even thinking about competition, but instead thinking about collaboration. And that idea of joy that one can discuss academic topics of research with colleagues who gets exactly what you work on, this is a gift that David Shneer gave to so many of us, and it came through his colleagues. I'm jealous of his colleagues who got to work with him closely every day like that, and teaching and research too, but also to the field. And I would say that for the field of Soviet Jewish history and Russian Jewish studies, that idea that you can share your research, you can get input and insight, and also the way he supported junior scholars and also scholars from the region itself, that made an impact that transformed the entire field. And I was just thinking about this recently, that the field of Soviet Jewish studies, until a very recent time, did not have any scholars born in the region. These scholars always came from outside: Tzvi Gittleman, Mordechai Altshuler, Yaakov Roy, David Shneer. But unlike all these guys, David Shneer actually took those East European scholars seriously, worked with them collaboratively, and you know, thought about insights. It made his scholarship better, and it also gave opportunities to others. I would say that one thing that came up a lot today in the discussion is you know, what are the major contributions of David Shneer's work? And, you know, the pushing boundaries already came through in your presentation and in others, and it is true. And it's, I know Soviet Jewish studies better, but of course it's also queer studies. It's also studies of post-Soviet Jewish diaspora and generally kind of Jewish diaspora, the photography, Holocaust history. And David and I talked a lot about what it means to do Holocaust studies, because now we take it for granted that you study photographs and that becomes the main topic, and it's a field to be taken seriously. When he started working on his Through Soviet Jewish Eyes project, that was quite revolutionary. He was not an art historian, working on all these photographs and bringing Soviet photographers into discourse. All these things that people now take for granted, he took a risk and made it mainstream. And it's this idea that one can take a risk and then one doesn't have to know everything in order to make an impact. I think that is another way he was able to push our knowledge forward, but also push forward the thinking and critical thinking. And if I have to summarize his impact on the field of academic knowledge into humanities, in general, beyond specific areas of inquiry, I would say that he always focused on studying intellectuals who allowed themselves to have freedom to think what they wanted to think, even if societies where they lived did not support or sometimes even imprisoned them for this free thinking. And the conversation about what would David do today and where would he stand, I think this idea that studying and supporting and celebrating an idea of free thinking, no matter how restrictive the society becomes, this is something that he gave us as a gift, and I hope we take advantage of that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Erin Hutchinson, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the significance of David's work for my work, as well as the field of Soviet history a little more broadly. I got to know David really when he was the chair of the search committee that ultimately brought me to CU, and I can say that from the applicant's perspective, he was just so incredibly kind and encouraging. I really could not have imagined a better search chair. My son Alex, who is 5 now, was just 2.5 months old, and so I was bringing him with me across the country, and my mom met us in Denver, and was taking care of him while I was doing these interviews, and David was just so supportive the whole time, and was just a really amazing search chair. And David passed the first year I was at CU. I was actually a postdoc, so I was always so disappointed that I didn't ever really get to experience having him as a colleague. But having him as the search chair is something that I'll always remember. So thinking a little bit about Soviet history. So when I was an undergraduate studying Soviet history, and especially interested in non-Russians in Soviet history, I'm embarrassed to admit that I didn't really see how Jewish studies was part of that picture. Like institutionally, where I was studying, there was the Russian Eastern European Studies Center, and there was Jewish studies, and there wasn't a lot of overlap. And I picked up on that as an undergraduate. And so for me, David's main contribution to our field is really helping this broader process of writing Jews into this narrative of Soviet history and showing how Jews were really essential for its development. So in my own work, David and I are both scholars of Soviet cultural politics. But what does that mean? So culture, including art, literature, and film, as I'm sure most of you know, was incredibly important in the USSR. And this is a legacy from the Tsarist period, because under the very oppressive Tsarist regime, Russian literature was sometimes the only venue for expressing political views and hashing out political arguments. And so then when the Bolsheviks seized control of the Russian state, they placed tremendous value on culture and sought themselves to control it. So in the USSR, as under the Tsarist government, literature and culture in general was an incredibly important means of doing politics. And David's work in his first book really helped to show how Yiddish-speaking Soviet Jews were so much a part of this process, just like so many other people in this post-revolutionary context. And so in my own book manuscript, I cite David's work as an example of the cultural politics of the 1920s as a precedent that I'm building on. In smaller ways as well, I remember as I was working on my manuscript introduction, I was just really having a hard time articulating a particular concept, and so I just busted out, my PDF of his introduction and read how he explained it, and then was like, okay, now I can write my sentence on this. So that's one really big way that overall, that's a big way David has influenced my work. Also in teaching, I often make a point of referencing David's work on Yiddish literature in my lectures on early Soviet nationality policy, just to make the point that the early USSR was truly dedicated to promoting socialist culture in all these different languages of the peoples of the USSR. Because students often come to the class in Soviet history, and if they know anything about Soviet Jews, they might, maybe, know something about anti-Semitism. And of course, that's part of the picture, and we want to talk about that. I was talking about that in class today. But I think it's also important that they also understand that during that period of the 1920s, there were many Yiddish-speaking Jews who were incredibly excited about this revolutionary moment, and they were themselves fully a part of it. I also use Through Soviet Jewish Eyes, which provides incredibly great material to teach with. I use the images from these pioneering Soviet photojournalists to illustrate my lectures on topics like industrialization. In my seminar that I offer occasionally on World War II, I've assigned chapters from the book. I designed that class so that each week the students look at a different type of primary source. And so for the week on photography, of course, I used David's book. And during the class, I walked students through one of his analyses of an image by Yevgeny Khaldei, Molotov's announcement of war, as a sort of like master class of how to analyze an image. Just because you're trying to teach in these seminars students how to analyze things on their own for their own research papers, and just to see someone like David just be able to take apart an image and just analyze it so well, it's such a great example for students. So I think I'll just stop here, but just to say that his work has really been really influential for many of us in Soviet history, and it's something that I'm always very happy and excited to try to include in my courses as well.
So I'm David Ciarlo. I'm a German historian, but I'm also a visual historian. And David Shneer also was on the committee that hired me. And he was so wonderful in that interview that I remember coming out thinking he would make a fantastic colleague, and he absolutely did. He's an outstanding colleague. We've talked a lot about that, a great human being, a wonderful friend. But he was also a brilliant thinker, and I don't say that lightly. Multi-talented researcher, but he also had a real humanity to his own scholarship, which I think is really important and had a real influence on me. He had a knack for grasping complex concepts and theoretical approaches and making these concepts, making these theories understandable by showing how it worked in the actual real world and the everyday experience of people. And I want to talk a little bit about what Erin was talking about Through Soviet Jewish Eyes as an example of that. This book it's really 4 books. I brought my little show and tell. It's 4 books in one. It's a history of photojournalism in the Soviet Union, but even written more broadly, one in which Soviet Jews became involved and working their way from southern Russia to Moscow to make their careers, and he talks about how they navigated the ups and downs and the craziness of official Soviet policy swings, and that's fascinating. But the second thing it offers a photo history of the Soviet experience as well, and especially the Second World War. It's a visual history of what people knew during the war, what they knew about losses and destruction, what they knew about victory, what they knew about Nazi atrocities, and what they knew about Jewish tragedy in the Holocaust. And citizens learned about these victories and tragedies through the photographs that they saw published in the newspapers, and that's all laid out there in David's book. But thirdly, and this is where he got me as a visual historian. And a lot of the reviewers of this book just completely missed it entirely because it's really subtle. But it's a theoretically astute, deep dive into the power and influence of images. How did images that people saw shape what they experienced? How did photos shape what was remembered long after? Because images have this way of sort of pressing in on us and imposing themselves and imprinting themselves on our memories, and sometimes even changing our memories. I remember one time David was giving a talk, and he was using a photo from the book. This is the Khaldei's iconic photograph raising the red flag over the Reichstag. You've all seen it. It's the Iwo Jima photo for the Red Army raising the flag over the Reichstag. 3 Red Army officers at the edge of the roof holding up the flag. The flag is in front of the ruins of Berlin destroyed below them. And David pointed out, look, one of the men holding the flag has 2 watches on his wrist. But when this was printed in newspapers and magazines throughout the Soviet Union, the watches have been erased because the watches probably were looted. And you don't want an iconic image celebrating the heroic victory of the Red Army over fascism with a hint of theft or looting to sort of stain the image. And that was the kind of intense, detailed analysis that he did. And the 4th element of the book is it's a really nuanced look into cultural identity. What is Jewishness? He asks in the book. Was there a particularly Jewish way of seeing the world that we can see in the photographs themselves? And he says, no, there's not, right off the bat in his introduction. And most people sort of believe that. But then when you read further into the book, he shows us it's actually much more complicated. Through the personal journeys of the photographers, through the close analysis of the photographs and their history, he shows us a more complicated, more nuanced way of looking at Jewishness as an identity. Identities in his book are multifaceted. They emerge, they recede in different contexts. The identities change over time. The photographers themselves insisted that they are all Soviet citizens first and foremost, and yet David shows in their image, their lives, their journeys, and also closely analyzing the photographic work, we do see patterns. We see patterns. David shows how we can see the influence of identities of Jewishness at certain moments when documenting Nazi massacres or documenting death camps. The official line was portray the victims as generic, peaceful Soviet citizens, and they do. But these Jewish photographers still found small ways to point out or suggest the Jewishness of the victims in the art of the photography themselves, in the details. And viewers picked up on these subtle cues, and they noticed these subtle cues. And as someone who works with visual history, to see that close level of analysis done so effortlessly, I don't think it was effortless, but done so in such a fluid and organic way, it's just profoundly impressive. I think one more thing in the book is there's this sense of loss in the book. The photographers are documenting the Holocaust, and obviously that's a horrific loss we can't even fathom. But there's also loss in the book of many of the photographers they faced after the war, the loss of their positions, the loss of their sense of purpose, and of course, decades later with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the loss of that Soviet project itself. And the loss throughout the book, this time when I was looking it over again before this conference, it was much more clear to me and much more haunting. And because in this last reading that I did of the book, the sense of loss throughout intertwined with the loss of David himself, a brilliant scholar, a thoughtful mentor, and a generous friend.
Hi, my name's Nick. I echo a lot of what, can I call you? I'm going to tell the story in a second.
Colleague,
right?
Absolutely.
Colleagues have shared up here, so I'll add just a few thoughts. But one thing I will say is the reason I'm here today, unlike Erin and David, who David hired them to come here. The last time I was on campus was May 7th, 2016, was the day that David hooded me for my PhD. He was my Dr. Vater. So that was the last time that I was here. And so I've been thinking today and listening to everyone talk about their experiences and the effect that David had on their scholarship. And I'll share a couple of thoughts about what I think he's done for me personally as I've kind of developed as a historian and now kind of made my way into the profession. Is, you know, I came to CU wanting to do a project related to Yiddish in France. And I remember going on my first research trip to Paris, and I was told, this is not going to happen. You're not going to find the sources to do this project. And I came back and I told David this, and he was like, that's the reason you have to keep doing this, because it must have existed. It had to exist, right? So he kept telling me, just push this idea forward, just keep pushing it, keep pushing it. And, you know, one of the things that I really appreciated about his approach to Yiddish studies was that he really forced us, and a number of us in the field, to kind of look beyond the traditional centers of Yiddish culture, right? For him, so what if it wasn't Warsaw? So what if it wasn't New York? So what if it wasn't Moscow, right? This is Paris, and perhaps there is a story to be told there. You know, some of his later scholarship too, looking at Yiddish cabaret singers in the DDR, in East Germany, right? One of the things that I think has been very influential to me is recognizing the value of, especially in Yiddish studies, looking at spaces that are kind of beyond the traditional, I think that the traditional nodes on the Yiddish cultural map, as we would sometimes refer to them together. And so that's, I think, for me, kind of like been one thing that was very inspirational and has really affected my scholarship, is to remind ourselves that, you know, there's a lot of boundaries that need to be pushed in our fields, and it's exciting. It's really valuable to push those. And you know, one of the things that he also did in his scholarships in terms of pushing boundaries, and this is kind of one of the things we've talked about a lot, which actually goes back to the comments about the tragedy and the joy, something that I took from him very much, we were actually talking about this earlier today, is, you know, a number of the people that I write about in the 1920s and the 1930s ultimately are murdered, either by Vichy or the Nazis. And we had many, many conversations about that, about what to do with the realization that some of the work that these people were doing, whether it's in the Soviet Union in the case of his first book, or in my case in Paris, what do we do with the fact that ultimately their cultural projects failed, right? They did not work. They did not lead to the integration that they perhaps thought they were going to. And David used to always say, well, it doesn't matter, right? In 1922, they didn't know that that was going to happen. In 1933, they didn't know, right? And it's important to kind of not necessarily look at the tragedy, but then sometimes like focus on, if not joy, the actual work that these people were doing in their particular historical moments in an attempt to create community, home, scholarship, intellectual communities, whatever it might be, and really kind of challenge us and force us to think of people in their moments, regardless of what happens years or even a few weeks later. And I think that for me, that's been very, very kind of inspirational and how, not just how I study kind of Yiddish culture in the 20th century before and after the Holocaust, but also in my classes. It affects my pedagogy extraordinarily, right? There's always this emphasis on the lived reality of any of these people in their moments and what it is that they were doing wherever they were. I know that Robby and David took this approach very much so when they worked together through Yiddishkayt and their Helix program. Like, how do we root these people in their moments and look at actually what they were doing instead of focus only on the tragedy, right? And have the tragedy not be the focal point to how we sometimes look at the past, although the tragedy obviously be very important, figuring out and thinking through that, but also taking very seriously the lives that these people lived, either, like I mentioned in David's first book, or even through Soviet Jewish eyes. I'm going to say two other things because I want to be brief, because I want to be able to, we want to be able to answer a couple of questions. But like, David was a remarkable storyteller. David wrote the academic books with the footnotes and everything, but they're readable. And like, I don't think anything that I've written is readable. However,
That's not true.
However, I try. And I think it's because of David's influence, right? This ability to like try to tell a story while also doing the very serious, deep thinking, analytical thinking about what is at stake, and try to figure out a way to translate that to a potential audience beyond 5, and how do you do that? And I think that that's really, for me, and I think a number of my colleagues, has really kind of embraced that mode of you know, taking serious the storytelling behind all of this. The other thing too that still is very influential to me is, and this has been hinted to many times in kind of different discussions about his various kind of roles, either at DU or here. Within his scholarship, he was an extraordinary collaborator, either with Karen, Aviv, Robby, Anna, Greg, He and I even collaborated on things, in a field where sometimes we can be seemingly so lonely. He really, at least for me, and I think a number hopefully in the room, really challenged that we can do scholarship together. We can collaborate, right? And this is important. This is an important mode of production, and to learn to embrace that has been transformational for me in thinking about how I continue to do projects, how I think about projects, how I think about how it's not just about there's work, there's value in collaborating, thinking together, and putting intention behind the type of work that we can do, and it doesn't have to be a solitary kind of mode of production. So I think that those kind of things, take Paris seriously, take their lives seriously, and perhaps collaborate are three of the areas that he's really influenced my life.
So my plan had been to ask one or two follow-up questions. I'm looking at the time, and we have around 20 minutes. And so I actually wanted to ask, before I run another question past you, whether there are questions or comments from the audience, either here or on Zoom, because I would like us to have a conversation. And if not, trust me, I have many things to ask these good folks. But I either work with them or am spending all day tomorrow with them, and so my questions can happen at another time. Are there questions from the audience, either in the room or in the Zoom room? And, we've got a microphone. For the folks on Zoom, if you could wait, Sid, here you go.
Thank you. So to the observation you made about how David was open to so many different ideas and things like that, it's interesting. I'm an independent scholar. My wife and I got to know David partly through, I was taking classes at CU, ordering classes since I retired in 2004. So I took one or two classes with David, and then my wife wrote a book about her letters between her parents during World War II, and he actually was one of the reviewers and wrote a very nice big blurb that's on the thing once. But I'm also an independent scholar, and I'm interested in things like Shakespeare and everything biblical and evolution and all these other kinds of things, okay? And so I have these ideas that I throw out sometimes, and once in a while I just write David them, right? And one time I said, I hope you get a chance to read this. And David wrote back, I read everything you write. It was just, that was the kind of person he was.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to add something also, not as a scholar. In addition to the fact that he wrote this wonderful blurb that's in my book, he came to our house when he was working on putting the archives together. And what he said at that point was that he wanted to create the biggest, the best post-Holocaust Jewish archive in the world. And he came to our house because I had a number of items from my parents and a number of items from my involvement with Hadassah. And he sat in my kitchen for hours and went through papers and boxes and picked and chose what he wanted. And they are in the collection. And I just have such a fond memory of her sitting in my living room, not as a scholar to me, but just as a human being committed to building this archive. And I've just always appreciated that.
Actually, he came twice. We've made two different contributions.
We do have one question from Zoom.
Please. Go ahead.
The person who asked this prefaced this by saying it's an unfair question. So I don't know whether that makes you more or less likely to answer it, but do with that what you will. And the question is, what advice do you think David might have for us as we think about kind of the role of higher education in the United States today? I think Anna spoke a little bit about this when talking about kind of free thinking, but any thoughts about sort of what either David or someone kind of operating in the spirit of David's scholarship might have to say as we kind of wrestle with what it means to be involved in higher education in the world today.
Okay, you have things to say? I'll try, and then, one of David's great qualities as a scholar, as a person, was to, okay, how should I put it without, not too colloquial way, but to cut through positionality, virtue signaling, and a lot of this kind of stuff that, are part of academic life. So he was a visionary scholar, accepting scholar, dealt with tons of projects. But at the same time, he also saw through a lot of conversation about nothing. And I think, that way of keeping the eyes on what's important, what's worth studying, what's at stake if we don't study this. These are things that are crucial at any moment. And I don't know, I keep thinking that this would be something to, that will be important to him. We all talked a lot about missing David in different ways and all this, but I often think about, dealing with campus climate today. There are so few people with whom you can talk about what you think about openly, without censoring, without, thinking, am I going to say something wrong to this person, even if you don't even know this person for a long time. With David, I did not have that problem. A lot of other people did not have that problem. He had a way of being able to have a conversation without making people censor that conversation. Well, I think that's culture that is unfortunately not as present anymore, and maybe it wouldn't be a terrible thing to bring it back, but so I think he would be doing that in this climate, but I don't know, maybe other people have better answers.
I just wanted to add to that. I think with David, he had this really unusual way of combining activism and humanity. And he would see the humanity. I mean, he would commit himself to try and make the world a better place. But he also would recognize that the people he was, in many cases, that he was trying to convince were also people. There was a sense that he recognized everybody's humanity, and you could recognize that he recognized that. And so it made him extremely disarming. But at the same time, he was absolutely committed to with all sorts of different projects to making things slightly better in a peaceful, warm, and wonderful way.
If I may say something, even though I'm the moderator, I think building off of what David just said, I think that also, that commitment, he had commitment to a kind of scholarship. I think sometimes activist scholarship, the activism becomes the tail that wags the dog of the scholarship. And I think that other times there's scholarship that can't, maybe that wants to be making some sort of activist intervention and just doesn't figure out how to bridge the gap to the public relevance. And I think a lot of the brilliance of David's scholarship was that he had deep and profound scholarly integrity. His activist commitments never created problems in his historical analysis. He was a superb historian, but the questions that he asked were questions that were designed to create histories that, without fudging his data, without compromising his analysis, was also justice-oriented history. And I know that is certainly one of the lessons that his work that I hope to be able to emulate in my work, but I think it was a real gift, and I think it's an extremely unusual gift. So I'm not sure, for instance, I want to emulate it, but I'm not at all sure that I can. But it was really, and I think it comes in part from the same activist humanity piece. I think there was the seeing of another person's humanity. I think he also saw the world of his archive.
One thing I think is about this present moment is that David was an outspoken anti-fascist. And I think that would have, if David were working at this moment, would have been a major part of what he would be doing at this very moment. I mean, and while we like to point at the peaceful intervention, I think it's also important to think that David's one of his last projects is called Kunst ist Waffe, art is a weapon, and that what David was looking at was how people who are seemingly powerless can stand up to the powerful and the people who are marginalizing others, who are excluding others, who are harming others. And I think that one thing that I know about David was his outspokenness, and his fearlessness, and that there's a climate, I think, on many campuses and many spaces of fear around many subjects right now. And one of the things that I think that I know about David was that he would not be cowed by any of that right now, and be able to speak the way he always spoke, truthfully about these subjects, and to say, even in the material that he works with, that there is a cult, like we talk about in many fields, but the Kulturfront, the front of culture, that there is a way that what he studied was a way of understanding how to defeat or fight fascism with art, with culture, and to potentially to bring down tyranny. And I think that that is a big part of what David's work was always about. And I would imagine that at this very moment where we're confronted with tyranny in so many spaces, that he would have been outspoken about everything that is going on with tyrants in power and with the committing of genocide in various spaces in the world, and that he would be able to speak to that truthfully and in a way that would be fearless.
Ryan?
Hi, I did not know David in an academic context much at all. I sit here so impressed, and also impressed by the fact that he was so humble, because he could have been a real jerk given what was in his brain. But he wasn't, and 20 years ago when I moved to Colorado, I didn't even know there was an intersection between my Judaism and my gayness. And David and Greg introduced me to a community where both were accepted and celebrated and overlapped. It was wonderful. I guess my question is, what loose ends academically did he leave that you find yourselves or your students pursuing? What are the unanswered questions that you and others can answer that, you know, fulfill some of his thirst for knowledge?
You know, you're sitting right next to Greg, and he just told us about all this unfinished project. I think Greg should answer that question.
Well, I will just, on a literal note of unfinished projects, there were 3 unfinished projects. Some people in the room are aware of the most significant unfinished project, which was a book project that he had won a prestigious fellowship to finish that he was unable to complete before passing, which was on the Art is My Weapon, anti-fascist Yiddish music as a form of social change. That is a much more complicated story that also involves the last person to see Anne Frank alive and many other interesting elements. But he was also already in the initial stages of planning 2 other projects, one on the biography, the early years of the journalism years of Elie Wiesel, whom many people don't know much about, when he was a journalist working for newspapers in Israel.
and a very different person than he became later when he became this iconic sort of emblem of Holocaust memory. But he was also working on an interesting project about the way in which post-Soviet Jews, often without people being fully cognizant of it or focusing on it, had been slowly and in important ways reshaping the Jewish landscape in the United States, in Israel, in Europe, and around the world, and in very meaningful and powerful ways that I think he saw a spark of opportunity that people weren't really reflecting on. And so those were 3 projects he was actively working on when he died. And by the way, he was working on his book manuscript about Lineal Dati, The Art is My Weapon, days before he died. He was continuing to work till the very end. He was also sending emails to Nick and Anna about the Eastern European Jewish Affairs Journal, and engaging in work up to the very last moment. Even once, I think, sending a very kind email saying that, well, he was ill, and therefore he was unfortunately not going to be able to take up the very gracious opportunity to speak at a conference that someone had just suggested about 3 weeks before he died. And they didn't know much about him. They didn't know he was sick. And then when they found out he died, they called me because they were just overwhelmed that David, 3 weeks before dying, had taken the time and the care to share with them the great honor that he experienced of being invited to be a part of a scholarly community that they were creating.
Are there other questions in the Zoom room, or we've got a few more minutes if there are other questions that folks would like to share, or memories, I think.
I met David before I applied to graduate school, and he served on my dissertation committee and saw me through the whole beginning of my career, and I was very happy. Nick and I finished around the same time, and I was very happy that he saw both of us get jobs, which was great. There's a lot to say about his impact on my scholarship, and I talked about that today, but I actually want to just note that he also taught me how to rest. I don't know if you encountered David in non-working situations, but he had this wonderful ability to kind of bridge work with pleasure. And some of our best conversations about scholarship were like sitting in his parents' pool, or, and just, he knew how to really take a break and encourage people to recharge, and he knew how to recharge. And it's amazing because he combined that with what we know is such a tremendous work ethic. And I also asked him how he wrote such legible books, and I said it seems so seamless, and he said I worked really hard at it, and it also really taught me to work really hard at my writing. But he also knew how to rest and how to enjoy life. And I often, when I feel that I can't stop, I remember that that permission that he gave himself, and that I think he models for all of us. Mm-hmm.
Well, with that, I'm going to bring the evening to an end. I'm going to just offer a few thanks. Once again, I would like to thank the Ann Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto, the College of Idaho, the Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Denver, and here at CU, the Dean of Arts and Humanities, the Departments of History, Religious Studies, and Women's and Gender Studies, and of course, the David Shneer Fund for Public Scholarship, Community Programming, and the Arts. I'd like to thank Third Harmonic for the sound and the streaming. I'd like to thank the Jewish Studies staff, Felicia Naranjo Martinez and Maggie Rosenau. I would like to thank everyone who traveled to be part of the workshop, everyone who has been a panelist this evening, all of you for joining us. The last communication I had with David was me knowing that he was very sick. It was maybe 4 weeks before he died, getting a book contract and asking him if he had sort of space for my good news. And he texted back so enthusiastically, "Tell me." And I want to say that I hope that in this moment, we were able to bring some of our appreciation for the enthusiasm that he brought to all of us and our contributions to a world of ideas, a world of art, a world of activism, and to community broadly speaking. And I hope that we have been able to indicate to all who loved him and remembered him how very important he continues to be in the conversations, scholarly and communal, that animate our intellectual lives. Thank you very much.